Nothing contained in this podcast should be considered a substitute for professional medical advice. This content does not represent our respective employers and is purely the opinion of the podcast hosts. We are not your personal medical providers. Sorry, friends. So, if you have any questions or concerns or seeking advice, diagnosis, and or treatment, please seek individual, personalized advice from a healthcare provider in your area. We are not liable for any risks or issues associated with using or acting upon the information contained in this podcast. This is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only, so enjoy the ride. Welcome to Medical Media Mixer, the perfect cocktail. I'm Nicole Peniston, licensed psychologist.
And I'm Tara Prisco, physician assistant. All right.
So I would ask you how you're doing, but I know that you're not doing well.
I'm coughing my fool head off.
So I'll try not to ask too much of you to make you cough.
It depends. It comes in fits. Like I'm fine, and then I get a tickle, and then it's like, boom. So I have the mute button ready to go. See?
Ooh, look at that. We need video of that. She's coughing up a lung and giving a thumbs up.
See? Okay.
And coughing again. So while she's coughing, I'll tell you guys about my cocktail. So my cocktail is called the Half-Lives, and it's in honor of a book. I did not read this particular book, but it is connected to my topic. So the Half-Lives is found on historiamag.com, HISTORIAMAG.com, in their article, How to Radium Party. So that gives you a little hint about what I'm going to talk about. But the Half-Lives cocktail made by the author of this article contains 50 mLs of gin, 12 mLs of creme de violette, and half a lemon. You add those things into a cocktail shaker, shake vigorously for no more than 5 seconds, strain into a glass, and then top up with dry Prosecco, which is optional. I did not have dry Prosecco, but I had some dry like Riesling, so I topped off with that, and I added some frozen raspberries because I just happen to have them. So I am going to talk today about the book and the movie called Radium Girls. So I'll just get right into it. Radium Girls is a book and a movie based on a true story about female factory workers in the early 1900s who contracted radium poisoning from painting radium dials. So at that time, a lot of these factories, this was, if we're looking back historically, this was around World War One.
Yes. It was a long time ago. Yes.
So basically, a lot more women were in the work field, and this was a particularly lucrative job because they were painting glow-in-the-dark watch faces on watches to be shipped overseas for the troops to be using. So, when they're in bunkers or when they're at night, they could use these watches to check the time and things like that. So it was both just lucrative for women to be working, but specifically in this field that they felt like was giving back to their country. And then also just a lot of people were using these watches, regular people were also purchasing these watches with the glow in the dark dials. And so they were painted with self-luminous paint, which contained powdered radium, zinc sulfide, which is a phosphor, gum arabic, and water. So what these women were doing, so these were largely younger women, typically 14 to, I believe, mid-20s, sometimes 30s, but they were choosing younger women, one, because a lot of them hadn't had children yet or weren't married yet, so they were single and able to work to help support their families, their parents, their siblings. And then because they were younger, they had smaller, steadier hands, and so they were kind of the prime to work in this field. The problem was in this field, when they were painting these dials, it was such small work to do that they were instructed to point their brushes. So if you're imagining a paintbrush, a very thin paintbrush, after dipping it into this paint and the water, the bristles might not be as sharp or as fine of a point anymore. So they were instructed to point their brushes with their lips, to like kind of suck on the paintbrushes to bring them back to a point again, to make a fine tip, to make their work easier. Also, for context, these women were paid per dial that they did. So the more they did per day, the more money they brought home to their families. So, and with every dial that we're doing, they were ingesting radium powder into their mouths multiple times per dial. And then they were doing multiple dials per day, and so on and so forth. So this book and movie centers specifically around the United States Radium Corporation, which had locations in Orange, New Jersey, so that's near where we're located, one in Ottawa, Illinois, and then one in Waterbury, Connecticut.
Did you see
The movie,
noted real quick? I saw noted somewhere on the author of Radium Girls said that the movie is not technically like supported by her or based on her.
yes, I will talk about that in a minute. Yeah. So I'm just talking about the book right now. So those are the three locations, and the movie centers mostly around the workers in the Orange, New Jersey factory, but later on they do talk about some of those other two factories as well. And so this case is important not just because we learned about the ill effects of radium exposure, but also it was one of the very first cases that was supporting labor laws and health and safety in the workplace, specifically for women, which back in the early 1900s, women didn't necessarily have as many rights. So this was really important for multiple reasons that this become a larger case. So the plant in Orange, New Jersey, which the movie focuses on and the book focuses on, was mostly women. A few men did work in the factory, and I'm not going to go too much into him, but one of the main reasons that this case got big was one of the male workers in the factory, who I believe was like a supervisor. He was keeping a small vial of radium in his pants pocket, and then he contracted, I believe, prostate cancer from that, or some sort of genital cancerous effects from the radium being so close. And that was when it was in a bottle. So it wasn't direct skin to skin contact. He wasn't ingesting it, and he still got very ill. And I do believe he eventually died before many of the other women died from it. So we're not really 100% sure what his story is, and the movie doesn't focus as much on him, but it was not just women who were affected by this. So I believe Tara, who's hacking up along, is going to talk more about radiation, and a lot of that overlaps with radium poisoning. So I'm not going to go too in depth, but a lot of these patients who were first seeking medical help were going to dentists because they were losing their teeth, having teeth pain, jaw pain, ulcers and lesions in their mouth, and tooth extractions were almost making these issues worse, because if you think about it, they're having teeth pulled thinking, oh, you have a rotten tooth, that's what all your mouth pain is for, and then you're going back to work, putting radium now into direct holes in your mouth. So it's only making it worse. From that, a lot of women developed anemia, bone fractures, and necrosis of the jaw, which is now known as radium jaw, where their jaw literally came out of their mouth and they lost the bottom part of their jaw. So obviously that's going to affect the ability to speak, to eat, to swallow, all that kind of things if you're losing the whole bottom part of your jaw. And then these women also experienced fertility effects, so suppression of menstruation and sterility. And they don't talk a ton about it in the movie, but in the book they do discuss how some of these women had babies who then had birth defects. And I don't believe, the few that did have babies, I don't believe any of those babies survived. And if they did, they had serious illnesses and birth defects moving forward. So just going big picture on this, the Orange, New Jersey factory began operations about in 1917, and the first worker from that factory died in 1923. So it was not that much longer. It was only about 6 years before there was the first death. And then before her death, her jaw literally fell away from her skull.
Fun.
Then by 1 year later, 1924, 50 women in the plant were ill and 12 had died.
Wow.
So this was definitely taking really, it was moving very quickly. And a lot of people at the time just legitimately didn't know about it. The people who worked in the factory, the majority of them did not know why these women were getting sick and dying. And at first, a lot of them didn't even associate it with the workplace. They just said like, oh, well, we all live in the same area. You know, we're all drinking the same water. We're, you know, maybe everybody's just sick. And so it wasn't until the inventor of the radium dial paint, Dr. Sabin Arnold von Schosky, died in November 1928. And he was the 16th known victim. That was when they really started taking it seriously. And so he was not the man I referred to before. He's a different gentleman who died from it, and he had gotten radium in his hands from handling it, just holding on to it. He wasn't putting it in his mouth like the women were. But the circumstances of his death helped the Radium Girls case when it eventually went to court, which is sometime later. Now, something that they don't cover too much in the movie, because I think there's so much in the book. The book is very long, very detailed, but an amazing history of all of this is a lot of these women were told that they had syphilis or sexually transmitted diseases or cancer of unknown origin. They were given reasons for their illnesses and their deaths. Their families were given reasons, but none of it necessarily traced back to the workplace conditions until people started putting it together. So the Radium Dial Company itself was similar to the United States Radium Corporation, but that was the corporation that was at work in Illinois. So they were related, but not the same business, but they were doing the same exact thing. And those women got sick as well. So all of this case became significant, became a book, became a movie, because in Orange, New Jersey, there was stories of abuse against workers just in the factory itself. There were a lot of young women working there. And so there were already allegations about misconduct of one form or another, whether it was just verbal abuse, there was some allusion to some sexual abuse. But once they started looking into, hey, what's going on at this workplace, other people were making these connections between all of these women getting sick. And so newspapers such as the Chicago Times caught wind of this story and referred to the women as the living dead and the doomed women, because at this point they knew something was going on, that all of these women were dying. And then that was when some particular doctors were really helping these women take on the case and go to court to sue the company for allegedly knowing that the radium was dangerous and not stopping the girls or the women in these factories from putting it in their mouths.
In the beginning, though, didn't they say that they had this ethereal glow and that was considered attractive?
So that's what I was going to get to. Because the paint glowed in the dark and everybody thought it was harmless, these girls were putting it on as eyeliner, putting in their hair, sprinkling it on their clothes, and they'd go out, partying at night. And it wasn't just women who worked in the factory. They just had the easiest access to the radium. They were actually selling radium powders and things like that for much, much more expensive to the general public to do the same thing with, to have a party with, and everything glows in the dark. And so at first, much like many things that we've learned are dangerous, like, cocaine for babies back then, we've learned that this isn't necessarily as good as it sounds. And so at first these women were kind of playful with it. And then as they each started to get sick, they found out that they were able to make that connection with the help of some doctors. In the book, they talk about one specific doctor who was really helpful in advocating for these women and finding them help, and also finding women. This was a doctor in New York, and he also had an attorney friend who helped them. But there were other doctors as well who were concerned about these girls. So it wasn't like they were going and most people were ignoring them. They had a good amount of support, at least in the smaller local communities. So when they first brought the case to the courts, initially, the United States Radium Company denied any wrongdoing, denied knowing that there was any issue, and they had a settlement for each of the Radium Girls for $10,000 each, which is equivalent to $183,000 in 2024.
Yeah,
so
it was
probably
the money conversion there. That's
and then in addition to that, a $600 per year annuity for as long as they survived. So it would be an additional $11,000. And then they were also paid $12 per week, which is equivalent to $200 for the rest of their lives. Also, all medical and legal expenses would be covered by the company. So all 5 of those women who won that settlement, their names were Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and sisters Quinta McDonnell and Albina Larice. Their case went to court in 1928. They had all passed away within 2 years by 1930.
So that payout didn't really last very far, huh?
Which they do talk about in the book, that payout was that settlement agreement was very specific on the company's part because they knew these girls were so far off that they weren't going to have to be shelling out as much as they were promising on paper. And so, but this was just the first of several court cases. There was another court case in Illinois about several women, same sort of thing, where they were suing the Radium Dial Company. And at that point, they were offered a similar settlement, and some of the women received no payout at all. And one particular woman who's kind of heading up that case, she died before the court case was settled. So the historical impact is that it really impacted the fields of health physics, so understanding what radium and other chemicals in the workplace can do to our bodies. Women's rights, as I was saying before, a lot of these women didn't necessarily have rights in general, so it was putting a spotlight on them. And then the labor rights movement. It also highlighted labor abuse, labor safety standards, and talking about industrial standards, what we now commonly know as OSHA. This was kind of the very beginnings of it. It wasn't OSHA at this point yet, but occupational disease labor laws began with this case. And so the scientific impact, the book goes into a lot, and it is fascinating. But there is a part in the book where they talk about how these women who had died, they had to be buried in very special vaults underground because there was so much radiation in their bodies once we now knew the impact of radiation. And I believe the book was published. At the time of the book was published, I'll get to that in a minute. They had, or like right before it was published, when the author was finishing the book, they had done testing on one of the corpses of one of the people, and they still had something like 510% more than the safe level of radium, and they had been dead since 1930. So
Jeez.
It's like just kind of looking at the impact of how much
the
they
decay
actually had in their bodies.
Right. Yeah. And it takes how many years for that decay to happen?
Exactly. So it's at MIT. They had body content measurements from 27 of the dial painters. And in 1941, the National Bureau of Standards used that to establish the tolerance level for radium, which is at 0.1 UCIs, which is it's called a Curie.
Yes, I saw that in mine. Yeah, the Curies.
Yeah. So, and then there is a very cool place called the Center for Human Radiobiology that was established at the Argonne National Laboratory in 1968, and they were continuing to provide medical examinations for the living dial painters, because obviously not every single one of them died, but at this point they were older and a lot of them had health issues. So when that project ended, because it was just a research project where they're taking tissue samples and following their health, it was in 1993 when that project ended, and they had detailed information on 2,403 people who had been afflicted. So a lot of people had that. And this is what I was going to talk about before. So this led to a book on the effects of radium on humans. The book suggests that radium-228 exposure is more harmful to health than radium-226. Can't tell you the difference, but there's a difference. Radium-228 is more likely to cause cancer of the bones, as it has a shorter half-life of radon-220 compared to radon-222. There's a whole lot of detailed stuff here. I don't really know what I'm talking about. I'm just reading off of Wikipedia. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a lot.
But basically what it was saying is the amount of radium that has been deemed safe, these women and their bodies after they passed had extremely high levels, like nowhere even near what is appropriate. So you alluded to before the movie. So there is also a movie called Radium Girls. It is starring Joey King. And I will tell you, I read the whole book. The book can be very graphic at times, talking about the health effects that these women had. So it's not an easy read, but it's a good read. I would recommend it.
I read like a lot of the book, and I don't know. I think it was the mood I was in at the moment. I just didn't finish it. I think you just need to be in a certain mood.
Yeah, it's not.
And it's rare that I don't finish a book, but I'll have to revisit it when I'm in the right mindset.
Yeah, it is quite long. I will say it's like at least 500 pages. So it's not like a short read. It's a long book, but it's worth all of it. So this movie came out starring Joey King. I believe it's still on Netflix to this day. Didn't get like great reviews, but didn't get horrible reviews. I do feel like the movie skipped through a lot of the background, a lot of the science, and just kind of was like, oh, cute girls got sick in this factory because they could glow in the dark. And then they went to court and the court was mean. And then they all died. So, I mean, yeah, that's like a snapshot of it, but there's so much more to the story. And so the book is definitely worth a read. And then you can buy the book. It's called The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women by Kate Moore. And she actually wrote another book recently that I haven't read yet, but I want to. It's similar. It's like a historical book, but she's actually known for romance novels.
That's interesting to go into such a heavy research-laden type of a subject.
I believe she found, I may be making this up, but I feel like I read something about the author, and I think she found out that she had a family member who and that was kind of what.
When I was researching, I kept there is some sort of an association or museum or something that's New Jersey based that still exists about this.
Yes, there is. I will get to it. It is somewhere in my notes. So basically, there's a lovely website called AIP.org, which is about history. And then when true things in history are converted to books and films, it kind of gives a review. And so it says, so it is on Netflix. The book came out in 2017, movie came out in 2018. And so what the movie left out or changed is some characters are just fictionalized. They're not based on real people. Others are based loosely on real people. And it seems like it was kind of just like willy-nilly. There was no reason for, oh, we use this person's exact name, but then change everything else. It kind of was just like they just picked whatever sounded sexy. And then I'm laughing because it says movie makers, especially when making movies about history, have a tendency to prettify the characters by making them physically attractive to modern standards.
I see that for sure.
And it says not only were the characters in this movie wearing fairly contemporary makeup, they all somehow managed to keep their medical sufferings not so unattractive as to be on screen.
Yeah, you have to look cute when you're dying. I mean, you know.
Right. Whereas if you read the book, there are actual photos of these women. It is quite graphic. So just, you know.
I read it on Kindle, so I don't even remember. Maybe the pictures were all in the book.
There's a whole bunch of black and white photos from like the court cases and when they're dying, and it's not great. And then there's a notable movie mistake, which I find interesting because I didn't know this. And they talk about it in the book, but not when it comes up in the movie. So I can see why it would be a mistake. In the movie, they say that the scientists in the movie tested the women for radioactivity by using a Geiger counter. But Geiger counters had just barely been invented and were not commonly in use at that point. When they talk about the Geiger counters in the book, it's talking about their corpses and the radiation levels
later, right?
Yeah, later on. What the movie does well is they use period advertisements, actual advertisements, and their performances make it feel what like the vibe of the 20s was at that time, and how radium fed into like this idea of like this bright future, like, you know, things are going to get better,
modern,
so
right.
And then what the book does well is just really talks about what these women and their families went through in their own words. There's a lot of interviews, documentation that they had, and then how a lot of the families were really invested in this book because they wanted to tell their family stories, their family members who had passed on. And so there's just a lot of really wonderful explanations about who these women were as people. And then they just happened to work in this factory and just happened to get this. So it's not like, oh, like, look at this poor victim. It's looking at this woman as a whole person and then what she went through and how she passed the way she did. And the book is really lovely because it really just talks about the courage that it took these women as they were literally physically dying. One woman was brought in a stretcher to testify in court. It's like they were just going to fight until they had no more fight in them. And so according to this website, the AIP, which I can't tell you what it stands for, but it stands for something good, it says that the book is definitely better than the movie, which I have to agree, having read both. And so another thing that came up when I was doing research on this was talking about how mental health intersects with this, less about anxiety and depression and more about self-advocacy and speaking up for oneself, and how important it was for these women who essentially were watching their friends and their sisters and their mothers and their cousins die. And they were not going to just be quiet about it. They wanted to talk about what was happening to themselves, to each other, and they didn't want people to forget. They wanted to talk about physical health being taken seriously, having rights, not letting all of this terrible stuff pull them away. They talk about being hopeful and, like I said before, fighting to the end. So there's a really lovely article that we'll link in the show notes about that. And then I've got another important story that I might cover on another episode. It's not like fully mental health, but it's like a little mental health. Is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Have you heard about that?
No.
So this happened about 10 to 15 years before all of this radium stuff happened, but there was a building which is still in New York. You can still visit it. It's actually a monument now, but it's called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. So do you know what a shirtwaist is?
Like a cummerbund? I don't know.
A shirtwaist is basically like do you remember
a
like
dickie?
Sort of, but like, you know how men used to wear those longer ones? And like you could kind of tuck it into like your belt, but it didn't have sleeve like that. So there was a factory in New York who made these shirts, and like I said, I'm not going to go too deep into it because I might cover it in another episode. There was a fire in this building and people were not able to get out.
I vaguely
people,
know this.
Yeah, people leapt to their death. This came up a lot after 9/11 because it was very similar where people were like jumping out of windows, trying to jump from one roof to another to get away from the fire. The problem with the Shirtwaist Factory is part of it just not having the appropriate fire exits and all of that stuff was there were a lot of chemicals in that factory, which led the fire to be as bad as it was. And then they also had a lot of very young people working there. So the youngest were 14-year-olds who had passed in that fire, and the oldest victim was 43. So these are still people who were relatively young, and it was mostly women and girls working in that, and the majority of them died from the fire, but some of them died from smoke inhalation or, like I alluded to before, falling or jumping to their death. And the majority of them were immigrants who were just looking for jobs, to support their families as they're new to the country. So that, and then combined with the Radium Girls, really started talking a lot about workplace safety, chemical regulations, all of that stuff. So I felt like it would be remiss if I didn't talk about that as well, since they are connected in that way, talking about rights in the workplace and safety. But there's a lot of articles out there about Radium Girls. I just covered, top level stuff. And as we know, there are still issues with workplace safety in all different areas. But I think as far as how chemicals go, I think we've come a long way since then.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's, as science progresses and there's new advances, there's probably things that we're not quite sure what the effects are going to be on people who are exposed to this stuff every day.
It's interesting that we think about it. It's 100 years ago, right, that this happened. But that's not that many generations ago. I mean, my grandmother was born in 1909. I mean, she passed because that was a long time ago, but that's 2 generations. That's not that long ago. And we think in this modern world that we're so protected, but that's not that long ago.
Well, and like to put it in context, I just found, so this was during World War I. By the time World War II started, there were better regulations about using radium in the workplace. But you also have to think of World War II. That was when after World War II, they were developing the Manhattan Project. So then we're talking about plutonium now,
right,
which is also a substance that is very dangerous for
right,
people. So I feel like we don't hear as much about that, probably because they were putting some of these safety things in mind, but also a lot of those people in the Manhattan Project were men. So they probably had better safety, more rights, things like that.
But something we'll definitely cover from the 80s, Chernobyl. So...
Yes. But
not in the US, but...
and I mentioned one of the episodes before when we were talking about Agent Orange.
Yes.
That's a whole deep dive. We could go in on that. There's a lot of things that are still happening out there. And I sometimes wonder, this is not necessarily chemicals, but just wondering the influence on things like being on Zoom all the time, if that's going to affect our health, our eyesight, lack of B12 from being outside. I feel like there are some things that are incorporated into our workplace now that on the surface are much safer than those things, definitely, but we don't know what the long-term effects are.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, blue lights from the screens and, everybody's vitamin D is low. Everybody.
Yeah, because we don't go outside.
Nobody, I'm like, you need sunlight. You're like a plant. Please go outside.
Yeah. Water yourselves. I'm not good at that either. And then there's also, it'll be in the show notes, there's a really beautifully written article from the Journal of Student Research about Radium Girls. It's called The Radium Girls, Eternal Glow, Politics, Gender, and Malpractice in the American Radium Industry by Claire Nam. And she was in high school when she wrote this. What?
Wow. That's pretty progressive.
2023, Horace Greenlee High School in the USA. Miss Claire Nam wrote this article. You work, girl.
Go.
Work.
Seriously.
Yes. And it's a really beautifully written article. It's like some parts of it feel like almost like she's telling a story about, this individual person, but then she's expanding on it. So
cool.
Really cool research and stuff out there. So that's all I got. Tara's coughing again.
I am coughing
for us.
I'm sorry.
That's what the radium cough sounds like. Or does consumption sound like that? We could talk about consumption on another episode.
I think consumption
talk about Moulin Rouge.
Consumption is tuberculosis, I'm pretty sure, right?
It is,
okay.
But we could talk about Moulin Rouge. My favorite book.
I totally forgot about this.
My favorite movie.
But in the car this morning, my youngest had said that she just learned about Marie Curie in school.
What?
Yes. And I forgot that she asked me if she could give a fun fact. And I said that I haven't used my kids' names in the podcast because I want to protect their anonymity, but I figured we could use her voice. And I totally forgot about this. So I'm going to I'm going to go grab her. We'll edit out the long pause.
No, I'll talk to our listeners while you go grab
All right,
her.
let me go grab her. Hold on.
So her kiddos are super smart. So I'm sure this fun fact is going to be amazing. But also for those of you who don't know, Mary Curie, hopefully this isn't her fun fact, or if it is, then we can edit this out. But Mary Curie actually only won the Nobel Prize with her husband, even though she did the majority of the research. So again, women's rights, go Mary Curie, may she rest in peace. But she and her discoveries have really impacted the medical field and what we use radium for radioactivity, all of that good stuff. And so I think we're going to have our fun fact now. Here she is. She's putting the headphones on. Get ready for this adorableness. Hi, friend. I'm not going to say your name. I want to hear your fun fact.
Some people think her husband died because he got hit by a car, but it was the radiation, because when he got hit by the car, it weakened his bones so he couldn't get up.
Whoa. I didn't know that fun fact, which is good because I said a different fact and then I worried that I was stealing your fact. But good job.
All right. Is that good? You told your fact?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to pause
Awesome.
it back.
That was our fun fact from Cutie Patootie number 2. Who shall remain nameless. I called her Cutie Patootie number 2.
Aw, yeah. I figured, it was just random. We were talking this morning about it, and she started telling me something about Marie Curie, and I was like, wait, that's what I'm recording tonight.
That's so cool. I told a different fun fact, but they were connected. The fun fact I said while we were waiting for you was that she had to share her Nobel Prize with her husband, even though she did the majority of the work.
Seriously, it's all about that with the girls. All right, so I'm going to try not to cough my full head off. Just briefly, Marie Curie, and her husband, Pierre, but mostly Marie, basically are the ones who are credited with discovering radium, which is this element which we are talking about. There is a book, Radioactive,
which is funny. It's cited in 2 of my sources, that book.
Right. And there's also a movie. So the book is actually like a graphic novel that I did not read the book. I saw the movie. But the graphic novel actually supposedly has all this sort of artwork that sort of shows her thought process and is really beautifully done. So now I have to pick that up and get it. Maybe I'll get it from one of the kids because that little one,
you could get it for me.
Yeah, she really likes graphic novels. So even if there's a kid's version, the movie itself, it came out in 2019. So the book came out in 2010. The movie came out in 2018. It was on Amazon. It was okay. The actor, now, of course, all my links, I don't even remember what's what, but the actor was good. What was her name? Hold on.
Rosamund Pike.
There you go. She was excellent.
From Gone Girl.
Yes. But the movie itself was But, if it's factual in that, it gives you the information of how this all occurred. I'm not going to go into details about Marie Curie's life. I think we've all done like a project when we were kids or what?
I'm shocked.
You know that I was Marie Curie for Halloween once.
I'm even more shocked you're not going to talk about her life.
Because I'm not going to go deep diving.
She's French, 1890.
No, she's Polish.
Well, no, she lived in France.
Yes. So during COVID year 2020 for Halloween, I was a little cheeky, we'll say, and we all did science-based costumes for Halloween. So I was Marie Curie. Anthony was Bill Nye the Science Guy. The oldest child was a mad scientist with like all colored hair and splats of color. And the little one was, what's her name? From Magic School Bus, Miss Frizzle.
Oh. Well, I'm just looking at your sources. Sorry, friends, I'm cheating. But I love the plot of this movie because there's other things I can talk about spiritualism. I could talk about that.
Okay. I'm going to really just talk about what radium does medically because I'm going to focus on just radium specifically because there are larger things to do with radiation in general. And some of that will come up with Chernobyl and other things. But radium is a naturally occurring element. They just discovered it, honed it, understood it. So it does exist, and it basically is formed when uranium and thorium, two other natural radioactive substances, decay or break down in the environment. And it's found naturally in our soil, water, rocks, just everywhere. If you recall, you'll have your house when you're buying a house. Sometimes they'll test the dirt for radon or test the air for radon. Some states have like rules about that. That's kind of where they're going, but it is fairly naturally occurring, and the levels that occur in our environment are typically safe. Each, isotope of radium, like you talked about the different types, they release the radiation at their own type. So radium 224, 226, as you talked about. 226 releases its half-life of radiation in 1,600 years.
Yeah. So that was what I missed out on before. That's
Right.
why their corpses are still radioactive, because it lasts an extremely
Right.
long time.
Where something like 224, its half-life is about 3.5 days. So there's a big variation. Basically, we're not going to go into chemistry and physics, but when radium decays, it divides into two parts. One part is the radiation. The second part is called the daughter. And then the daughter is not stable, and then that continues to divide into another radiation and daughter.
Why is the daughter unstable? So judgy.
But it continues to go and go and go. And it releases these things, which this is where we get the concern. So alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. Alpha can only travel a short distance, so they're not going to be able to even penetrate your skin. Beta can go through your skin, but not all the way through your body. Gamma is where the real trouble is.
So you may not know the answer to this. What is what they use in x-rays?
I am not a radiology tech or a radiologist. It is not
just curious,
unsafe.
I'm sure everyone, someone's had an x-ray where they've had to put like the lead vest on you and things
yes.
like that.
Well, that's more, it's more, the reason we do the lead vest is more about repeated exposure. So one single solitary exposure isn't going to do anything. Actually, it's the techs who work there that are more of a concern, right? So they have to be behind the leaded wall. That's why if you were doing surgery that required, there's something called fluoro, where you're doing x-rays during surgery. So like hip or knee replacement, you're going to wear lead during the surgery because they're constantly bringing that arm in, taking pictures. But the actual patient, the amount they're going to get throughout their lifetime is really not significant. Maybe some of the older, this is a whole nother subject, but some of the older X-ray and CAT scans, so say when they were newer, they had more radiation than they do now. So a CAT
even
scan,
then they knew it wasn't safe, so it wasn't like they were just exposing you blind.
Right, but say somebody, so for example, we mentioned in the last episode that my sister had childhood cancer. She got a lot of CAT scans in her life, right? And back in the 80s, those CAT scans used a lot more radiation than a CAT scan does now.
Right,
so
and a lot of people might be thinking about radiation therapy when you have cancer. That's different.
Very targeted, very different. But either way, the gamma is really where we have a concern. So as far as our exposure to radium, it is, in our environment, levels of radium in public drinking water are usually less than 1 picocurie per liter of water. And then it is allowed to be up to, let me see. I think sometimes they can find up to 5 picocuries per liter. And there is somewhere in my notes a limit, like what the US EPA allows. I'll get to that at some point. But basically,
I said that before, 0.1.
Okay. Radium can enter the body when it's breathed, swallowed. They aren't really sure if it can be just absorbed topically through your skin. So remember, these women were taking this into their mouths. So it is going into their bodies and their bloodstreams. And then the concern is because once it enters your bloodstream, it goes to your bones because radium is similar to certain elements. So we'll get in a little bit, but it's literally attracted to your bones. And that's why it's specifically different than other forms of radiation.
Right. And to clarify what I was saying before, how the men in the factory who may not have been dealing with it directly, if this was in powder form, so it was likely in the air.
Right. They're inhaling it. Right.
Yeah.
But for months after exposure, small amounts can leave your body through feces and urine. Most of it, about 80%, will leave your body in feces. 20% will enter the bloodstream, and it'll go to other areas. And
we need a whole episode on poop because I have questions.
We have to find a poop forward media piece.
I'll find you one. I'm
a little scared.
No, I actually know of a cute book for kids for potty training that's poop forward.
Okay. But there's no clear evidence that, radium that's present in our normal environment. So 1 picocurie of radium per gram of soil is really unlikely to cause health effects. But it's the higher levels over long periods of time. And that's where we talk about that anemia, cataracts, fractured teeth, cancer, specifically in the bone, and death. But they can take years to develop. And it's mostly, like we talked about, due to those gamma rays, which goes through the entire body. Radium. So there's not really a lot of medical tests to determine if you've been exposed to radium. So if you came to me and asked me if I've been exposed to radium, can you test me for that? There really isn't much. There is a urine test apparently, and I would probably defer to like your public health department or some sort of an environmental agency to even be able to conduct that. There's also a test apparently that you can use to measure radon, which we talked about, which is a byproduct of radium when exhaled. So there's some sort of a breath test, but it's not done typically in an office like us. So here we go. The EPA has set a drinking water limit of 5 picocuries per liter for radium-226 and 228 combined, and a soil concentration of radium-226 in uranium and thorium, milled tailings, I know what that means, of 5 picoliters per gram in the first 15 centimeters of soil. So I guess in the depth of the soil. So, basically it's about the routes of exposure, like you mentioned, inhalation, right? Inhaling it in that factory.
I just realized you didn't talk about your cocktail. You could talk about it when you're done.
Oh, I'm sorry. The child's,
It's
got
okay.
all excited and it kind of threw things off.
When you're done.
We'll get to it. We'll close it off with the cocktail.
Yeah.
But basically, the routes of exposure, inhalation, oral intake, dermal, and parenteral, which would be IV. But we talk about toxic chemicals, and it's really, the biological effects are mostly related to the gamma rays. Radium is quickly distributed to the body tissues, and then it's into the bloodstream. It appears in the urine and feces, like we said. And then I'm trying to find the specifics on the bone here. Okay, so the fundamental...
I was going to say all the bone stuff is in the Radium Girls books.
Right, so the bone becomes the principal repository for this because similarity between calcium and radium. So your body has... Your bones, you think about them being like stable all the time, but your bones are actually constantly remodeling. So they're actually leaching calcium and then reuptaking calcium all the time.
Is that why they're porous?
It's not why they're porous per se, but it's just part of how it works is the calcium in your blood is actually sort of determined by that uptake in your body. And there's something called parathyroid hormone, blah, blah, blah. But the bottom line is that is why radium, because it's so similar, ends up in the bone. So it's considered what we call a bone seeker. That's what they call it.
You just taught me something. I didn't know that was how the parathyroid was connected. So thank you.
So parathyroid hormone signals your body's calcium levels and whether we're uptaking or depositing calcium in our bones.
Interesting.
And vitamin D is thrown in there, and there's a whole thing. But, basically... So the deposition of radium into hard tissues is basically the biggest concern. Basically,
like in my story, that's why they were first finding it in the teeth.
Right. Well, because it's directly there. So it doesn't have to go very far.
Yeah, the teeth and the jaw, it's right there.
Right. So radium deposit in bone, then it irradiates the cells of that tissue, causing sarcomas, which are bone tumors, in a large proportion of subjects. And then other lymphomas, because if you know that your bone marrow, which is inside your long bones, actually makes your blood cells, right? So if it is in the bone and there's radiation coming from it, it's going to affect your bone marrow, which is going to cause things like anemia and lymphoma, leukemia, aplastic anemia, things like that. Those would take a little bit longer to develop, but absolutely could be effects of this. And then radon, which is, like we said, one of the breakdowns of radium in the environment, can cause lung cancer. So that's why we check our houses for it. Mm-hmm. And like you spoke about, in the early 1900s, radium was used to treat actual things. They thought it cured rheumatism and mental disorders. They had tonics where you could drink it. We talked about the watch dials and all those things. And basically, obviously, we've learned our lesson since then.
And radium's not the first time that we've had to learn our lesson about something.
No, exactly. But medical radium is still used in one indication. So particularly the 223 of radium is indicated for treatment of men with castration resistant prostate cancer. So meaning that they're not talking actual castration, but chemical castration.
Like if you physically remove the cancer, they still...
Well, no. So prostate cancer can be responsive to testosterone. So you would put them on testosterone blockers, but there are some types that are not responsive to that, just like breast cancer. So in that particular circumstance, there is a medical use of radium-223, specifically because prostate cancer typically goes to the bone. And so this would help symptomatic bone metastasis disease. And as we talked about, briefly, Marie Curie and her husband, discovered this in 1898. But it took them about 10 years before they really honed in on how to use it. Medical professionals, like we said, were using it kind of all over the place. And we talked about that. Oh, the other thing. So we said the tonics, we said the dials, but they actually had toothpaste, facial creams, tonic water, everything, basically. They were radium spas. So radium cosmetics, combating the signs of aging. They called it liquid sunshine.
Yes, I did see that in one of my sources.
So again, we've now learned, radium can be used for prostate cancer and pretty much nothing else. I don't believe they use it for anything glowing nowadays. I don't think there's much.
There's other things.
Yeah, I don't think there's much else they use it for. But it is interesting. And like I said, radiation in general, we can cover in a much broader topic because radium is very specific because of the way it affects the bone. So, and that's why it presented so specifically in these women. So it was quite an interesting, topic.
I was looking up the museum that you were talking about and I couldn't find it, but what I did forget to put in my notes was talking about Superfund sites. So the location in Orange, New Jersey, where this factory was, it is considered an EPA Superfund site. So a Superfund site in general means that there is some sort of toxin in the soil, in the water, in that area. And so the EPA is tasked with cleaning it up if they can. And if they can't, they have to notify everyone who's living in a certain mile radius, depending on the toxin, that they're living in that area and then to watch out for health effects. So in my job, sometimes I will talk about if someone believes that they've had exposure to toxins during their mother's pregnancy or at some point early on in life. And so I have had people in the past tell me that they live near or on a Superfund site that is unable to be cleaned up. So it is something that happens. It's not just in New Jersey. It's the full U.S. has designated Superfund sites. And if you're curious, you can always go to epa.gov and it will tell you the list of all of the current Superfund sites and the level of exposure that you would have from those sites and then the process of cleanup, if any. There are some Superfund sites that cannot be cleaned. And I believe the one in Montclair, West Orange is one of them.
Yeah. I mean, I know New Jersey has quite a few. And I vaguely remember that when I lived in Piscataway, there was something adjacent to the development I lived in, but not in our actual development. But even things like you'll see like a gas station that's abandoned forever that they can't build on because of things. Like there's little things like that you don't even realize.
If there's a leak in the gas tanks, then they
there's a lot of
there. They can only build certain things there.
Right. All right, so let me tell you my cocktail. We'll close it out with a cocktail, and it actually is pretty tasty and is definitely very green looking. So it's called the Madame Curie cocktail. It's 1 ounce of blue curacao. I'm coming over my fear of blue curacao. Have you noticed?
I was going to say, this is like the third time you've used it.
I know.
Like, you clearly don't hate it
because
anymore.
It's not blue, it's green, right? Because when you mix it, it's 2 ounces of blood orange vodka. I actually just use a citrus vodka that I had. 4 ounces of premium low pulp orange juice. So the orange juice and the blue curacao make the green.
Makes sense.
Got it. And then a splash of Red Bull. which I'm a little scared because of the whole Red Bull story with the one time I've ever had it. And remember, we talked about Atlantic City, me not remembering things.
Red Bull does not sit well with me either.
We throw it all in a shaker. And I actually had to stop at like a 7-Eleven to pick it up. I was like, where do I get Red Bull? But you throw all that in a shaker, filled halfway with ice, shake it up, pour it in a martini glass, and it looks pretty cool. And it's a very cool shade of green. I did take a picture and I did email it to you. So we will post that with our socials.
But for those who are interested in New Jersey, we have 164 Superfund sites in New Jersey.
And we have the highest population density in the country. So,
but for those who are curious as to why New Jersey, as referenced in Miss Congeniality, we should be named the petrochemical state because we have the most refineries in New Jersey.
We do.
Far more than gardens and others.
If you've ever seen the opening to The Sopranos and them driving up the turnpike,
we've all been.
That's kind of where we grew up. Neither of us live in that area now, but that's kind of where we breathed our air for our formative years.
Yeah. And the majority of these sites, if you do look them up, they have been chemical corporations or landfills, things like that. So it's not like it's, was originally someone's house. Maybe it became someone's house. Interestingly enough, the FAA is one of the Superfund sites. FAA in Atlantic City.
Interesting.
Fun times.
So
there was something else I was going to throw in, and I can't remember what it was, but it's fine. Oh, I was going to talk about how we went to our turkey tray.
Oh, yes.
And the table right next to us were the ones who won our podcast basket.
Yes. So I hope they're listening.
See the people right there. Yeah.
Yes. I recognize one face from the table. I think she was, I believe, a year younger than us, or maybe 2 years younger than us in school.
So class of 98 or 99.
Somewhere around there. I think her first name's Patricia. Someone at your table won it. Maybe you're a listener now.
It was someone's mother. Because somebody at the table asked me, and they're like, she's not going to know how to do it. Tell me, and I'll explain it.
There you go.
Like, she'll figure it out. She can read.
And our table won nothing except for Nicole, who won
3 things.
Well, she won a giant bottle of Grey Goose. So she is like set for the podcast forever.
Yeah. Yes.
Like that was like at least $100 bottle, if not more. It was huge.
It was like the largest bottle they make of Grey Goose. I won that. And some double shot glasses, which is good because if you guys remember, about 4 episodes ago, I needed a double shot glass and I didn't have one. So now I have
Now you have one. And you won something about a website, which you're in
I
charge of.
We are going to apparently have a professional website made for the podcast. However, it is then required monthly maintenance fees. So we'll, depending on how much those fees are.
We'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
But we had a good time, even though we didn't win. We chit-chatted. Our moms came along. So it was interesting.
Had some friends who listened to the podcast talk with us about it. Passed out the business cards to a lot of folks who were there. I ran out of business cards. That's how many people were at this thing.
Yes.
So it was quite a crowd, but we had a good time. We always have a good time when we hang out.
Yes. So yeah, we saw each other quite a bit. Now we have to figure out our next meetup when we do a distillery visit.
Yes, we need to coordinate the times, and then I will do the heavy lifting of reaching out to the distilleries.
Yes.
Heavy lifting is used sarcastically. It's just emailing someone. I'm fine with that.
I also am steeping or infusing some vodka with our that mix, the lemon lavender.
Have plenty of vodka now to do the same.
Yeah, so I have to try it out and experiment to try and make our perfect cocktail, lemon lavender-ish.
I think it comes out clear, so maybe adding some creme de violette like I used in my drink today or something else to make it look more purple.
A little more purple. I saw I'm looking for some lemon lavender Cosmo-ish type recipes and adapting that somehow.
Well, I will say I was a little worried about the creme de violette, but it's a very, very subtle flavor. Sometimes violet flavor in certain things is too overwhelming, or just like lavender can be really overwhelming, but it's very subtle. So I would recommend
it. Sounds very spring, Eastery, sort of like violet, lemony, champagne-y tasting.
If anyone is looking at video, my bunny nails.
I'm going to stick your bunny nails on the socials for sure.
My nail lady Kelly, who does listen to the podcast and keeps her business cards at the front desk of her salon.
Oh, I love her. Hi.
She's amazing.
She's a friend.
Yeah.
I haven't been back to my Pilates studio in a couple of weeks because I've been sick. Husband's been traveling, but I do have business cards there. I need to really start promoting.
I have been leaving them, like if I go out to dinner, leaving them on the table or leaving them at the bar on my way out, just kind of dropping them everywhere. So hopefully we're getting some new listeners that way.
Oh,
I
wait,
hope
hold on. I think who had entered the chat last? There was another country.
the chat, a new country. Huzzah. I also realized I know someone in Australia who doesn't even know that we have a podcast, so I'm going to message them later today. Or
I
tomorrow,
know
depending on-
India for sure had entered.
What? Yes, India, enter the chat. Come through.
And wait, there was another one. Malaysia.
Come through, Malaysia.
Seriously.
Come through, India. Yes.
Yeah, so
Yes.
we've got some new friends. Actually, yeah, our stats here, I'm looking.
We
Yeah.
would love to travel to you guys and do a live show, so up your stats.
Yeah, seriously. Get some peeps out there.
Has anyone entered the contest yet? Because you're running that.
Yeah, that's the next thing we'll talk about, but so far no. So please, people.
Well, as you spoke with my friend Danielle, she was very interested in that. She asked you all the questions about it.
Okay, so everyone, Instagram only, go on, snap a picture of your screen or yourself listening to the podcast, make a post with the picture, because she asked me specifics, a post. In the comments of said post, put I'm listening to #medical media mixer in and whatever location you are, state or country. And I'll pull all those #medical media mixers, put them in a raffle to send you a cool prize, which is our lemon lavender infusion kit.
Which smells amazing. I haven't used mine yet, but we both own one, so we can vouch for it being good. And then, like Tara was alluding to last episode, if this becomes a big thing, maybe we can partner with that Etsy shop who created it to do some branding with us. We would love to do that. And then that's another small business we would love to support.
Exactly. So follow us on all the socials, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Pinterest.
And then send us emails to medicalmediamixer@gmail.com.
All right. So thank you for listening to Medical Media Mixer.
The perfect cocktail.
Cheers.